Alright, so here's our third key thinker for liberalism, and this one's about John Stuart Mill. And he's an interesting character, John Stuart Mill, because he's a kind of transition between classical liberalism and the branch of liberalism we're going to look at shortly, which is modern liberalism. So here are a few minutes, I would say 5 minutes, but maybe it'll be longer, we'll see, on his main ideas. You could encapsulate them all in this quotation. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized society against his will is to prevent harm to others. We're going to call this the harm principle, but it needs a little bit of unpacking, but really it says everything we need to about what Mill thinks about is the role of government and about liberty, and in particular that government should be limited. So you can get this from the work that I put on here, and you may have already watched these, the clips, which are quite useful, but this is meant to be a kind of quicker summary for you, so I'll try and cover it in these with little questions. So the first thing that we might think about with Mill is, how can people be happy? And that question about happiness comes from the type of discourse, the type of debate that liberals were having at the beginning of the 19th century. Mill had studied under, and his father had been friends with, Jeremy Bentham, a classical liberal, who'd come up with the idea of utilitarianism. And we can sum up that approach with Bentham's kind of saying, catchphrase, which was that the ideal society should pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, that sounds like the beginning of democracy, and it sounds like giving the majority what they want. And that's one of the things that Mill is concerned with. He understands that, yes, of course, we want as many people as possible to be happy. But what if you give the majority happiness at the expense of a minority? So what Mill's interested in is, how is individual freedom protected? And that's why he says freedom must be about each person's freedom to pursue the thing that they want and not be prevented from doing that by other people, and not be prevented from doing that by governments. And he calls this the harm principle, and that's why it's related to that catchphrase, or that quotation that I showed you before, that the only purpose of government should be to prevent harm to others. That's the whole point about government power. It shouldn't have the power to do lots of things. It should just be freedom from restraint, and government should stop other people from restraining other people from having pursuing their individual actions. Now, he's not prepared to let people do anything they want, but what he's interested in here is self-regarding actions, and he makes this distinction between self-regarding things that I can do, and really they only affect me. So if I want to, don't do this at home, but if I want to take heroin or something like that, so long as I'm not harming anybody else, so long as I haven't stolen money from somebody else or broken into somebody else's house to do so, or I don't go off on a killing spree otherwise, then as far as Mill's concerned, I should be free to do that. That's an important one for us about liberty, and we get this idea of negative freedom or negative liberty, which he doesn't invent the phrase, it comes along later on. And it's also about the role of government. What should government do? And as far as Mill's concerned, government should do very little, actually. That puts him firmly in the classical liberalism camp. Okay. So one of the implications of that harm principle is that I should be able to say whatever I want, so long as I'm not harming anybody else or preventing other people from exercising their own freedoms as well. And we often take this at a kind of basic level. Okay, that means everybody should be free to say whatever they want, and it's a core belief of liberalism anyway. And we've seen how that might apply in America, for example, with the right to free speech and Bill of Rights. You might say, well, there's nothing new about that. But actually, the free speech argument is central to John Stuart Mill and what makes him different from other liberals. Because unlike other liberals, he doesn't think that people's freedom comes from natural rights, that they're kind of God-given natural rights that we were born with, and that's what makes them inalienable. Because that in itself doesn't necessarily explain why they should work in the way in which they do in society. He thinks that we should have free speech and, by implication, individual freedom, because allowing each other to have our own free speech then allows us to test each other and to test our own opinions and beliefs about how we should act. And by so doing, the experience of doing that will sometimes mean that we have failures and sometimes mean that we make the wrong choices, but other people or ourselves will correct those bad choices. Other people will correct bad ideas that come out in society as well. So it's the free speech argument that, or the ability of people to make free speech, which then actually leads to a more rational society, which leads to the notion that we can have government among ourselves without requiring a government to tell us what to do. That's a really important thing for John Stuart Mill, because it means that we've got the right to be wrong, and that means that we can write a newspaper article or make a YouTube video or something like that and say something which is plainly wrong, but that's okay if we do that, because other people will come along and correct it. And so doing, wider society will have a better rational understanding of how the world is and what we should do to change it. There's another element to this, which means that free speech allows for plurality. So there isn't just one set of ideas, one religious set of ideas, or one ideology that comes from the state. As far as Mill's concerned, there are different ways of different societies achieving the happiness which they want to do. And that's another reason why government shouldn't have too much power. And further on from this, free speech, of course, allows us to have a check on government and to prevent government from becoming too powerful itself. And so being able to criticize government is the thing which then enables us to present arguments against the government to correct it or to remove it. Okay, so if that's what we're aiming for, how can we enable people to become more free? How can we enable society to become more capable of pursuing its own happiness and respecting other people's rights at the same time, and not having government become too powerful? Well, education is the key for this. Now, we saw this before with Mary Wollstonecraft, but that was really just about making sure that women were brought up to the level which men had been able to achieve in terms of status in society. And Mill doesn't really mean that, but he does mean that in order to respect other people's rights, we're going to need to be taught to be rational ourselves. We're going to need to understand why other people should have those rights. And we're also going to need to be able to be critical about information that we receive and challenge and rationalize that information so that we're not duped by other people's arguments. And that will, in the marketplace of ideas, that will make us all capable of testing each other's ideas better so that society comes to better rational outcomes. That's one element. The other thing that Mill thinks that we can do to make society freer is to have representative democracy. Now, this is really the first time we see a liberal thinker make a big argument about why people should have the vote and the way in which people should exercise that vote. But for him, the representative democracy isn't about what people want, it's about the type of representatives that we choose. And his argument is that we'll vote for people, but just like Burke, those people that we vote for won't just do whatever it was that we said, like a kind of delegate type of democracy. He would have thought of it as a direct form of democracy. He thinks that we should choose representatives who are more rational, who are better educated, and who are capable of making decisions in everybody's interests, in their constituency or in the country at large, and not just in the interests of the majority who wanted them. And that's a really important thing for Mill. He's against this idea of a tyranny of the majority. He fears the collective wisdom of the mob, and therefore he doesn't really trust ordinary people. It's got some important implications for how he thinks the representative democracy should work and who he thinks should have the vote. He doesn't, for example, think that absolutely everybody should have the vote in the 19th century. He doesn't think there should be universal suffrage. He does think the vote should be extended to some people. He's an advocate of women's rights to vote and the rights for some working class people to vote. But he plainly thinks that some people aren't capable of being reasonable and rational until they've been educated. And that gives us a bit of a clue about why John Stuart Mill might be both Jekyll and Hyde when we're thinking about his ideas. That he's got all sorts of great things to say in terms of happiness and protecting people's freedoms and liberty, and even the idea of extending democracy. But there are some issues about the way in which he thinks not everybody should be able to vote. I've put these in slightly different order on here, but when we think about votes for some people, what he's saying is not everybody should vote. Some people can be educated to vote, workers, women, and so on. Some people who are more educated, who are more capable, who who would be better, have a better understanding of what other people's rights are and how they should be protected, they should have more votes, like liberal philosophers, for example. There are implications for what he says about the role of government. If the role of government is only to prevent harm to others, to allow you to do as an individual what you want and to have freedom from restraint, what Mill is, by implication, saying is that the role of government has nothing to do with helping people who are poor. And so there is a freedom here, which is a freedom to starve. And he also adopted a kind of an economic liberalism that was current at the time, and that's going to be criticised, as we see later on when we look at modern liberalism, and the idea that negative liberty isn't enough. And what we really need is positive liberty. We need to enable people to do things, not just protect them from things. And frankly, John Stuart Mill's got some pretty unpleasant racist ideas. He was a colonialist who thought that non-Europeans were people who were inferior, who had not become sufficiently rational, and he thought of them as being children. And so in the days of a Victorian Empire, he also thinks that the role of an enlightened, more rational European civilization is to bring a light to the people who are living in darkness, in a kind of irrational darkness. And it's a while until liberalism manages to get rid of those kind of ideas too. Okay, those are your that's a quick summary of John Stuart Mill. I suspect that's slightly more than 5 minutes, but what it should help you to do is answer these thinking sorts of questions about what it is that Mill has contributed to liberalism and what marks him out as being different from the other liberal key thinkers. And as usual, any questions, drop me an email. Okay.